The Vladimir Tiara sits in a royal vault right now. 15 interlocking diamond rings, each dangling a drop that can be swapped between pearls and emeralds, depending on what matches the queen's outfit. It's exquisite. Priceless. And Queen Mary bought it in 1921 from the children of a woman who died in exile just 12 months earlier. A woman whose entire world had been destroyed by revolution, while the buyer's empire remained gloriously intact. That buyer was Queen Mary of Teck, and the Vladimir Tiara was just one item in a shopping spree that transformed human catastrophe into the glittering collection that Kate, Camilla, and generations of royals still wear today. Here's the thing about this story. Every single fact can be verified. The receipts exist. The ledgers survive. The dates are documented. And it was all perfectly legal. So let's talk about how one woman built the world's most valuable jewelry collection by shopping during an apocalypse. Mary of Teck was born in 1867 into circumstances that would shape everything about her relationship with beautiful objects. Her father, the Duke of Teck, was a minor German royal with expensive tastes and absolutely no money to fund them. The family experienced genuine financial difficulties, a humiliation for any aristocrat, but especially one connected to the most powerful royal houses in Europe. Think about what that does to a child. Young Mary grew up watching her parents struggle to maintain appearances, to keep up with wealthier relatives at family gatherings, to navigate a world where status and possessions were inseparable, where the quality of your jewels announced your worth before you even opened your mouth. She learned early that beautiful things mattered, that their absence was noticed and discussed, that their acquisition required strategy, patience, and cunning rather than mere inheritance. This wasn't poverty, let's be clear about that. Mary never went hungry, she never wore rags. But comparative poverty within aristocratic circles creates its own particular kind of wound. The constant awareness of what others have, the knowledge that you're being judged and found wanting, the understanding that your place in the hierarchy depends on things you cannot afford. This childhood gave Mary something invaluable: hunger. Not the desperate hunger of the truly poor, but the refined, persistent hunger of someone who's seen how the other half lives and wants it badly. She developed what you might call a collector's eye before she had anything to collect. She noticed quality. She cataloged it. She remembered who owned what, and she began, probably unconsciously at first, to imagine how those things might one day belong to her. By the time she became queen consort in 1910, that hunger had evolved into something more systematic, something almost predatory. Royal historian Hugh Roberts, in his authoritative book, The Queen's Diamonds, describes Mary with a single word that's followed her reputation ever since: magpie. The characterization captures her almost compulsive attraction to beautiful objects, her ability to spot quality instantly across a crowded room, and her willingness to acquire through whatever means presented themselves. But calling her a magpie is putting it politely. Magpies take shiny things because they're attracted to them. Mary took shiny things because she'd developed an entire system for doing so, refined over decades, executed with the precision of a military campaign. The admiration system became her signature acquisition method, and it operated with ruthless efficiency. Here's how it worked. When visiting aristocratic homes or attending functions where fine objects were displayed, and aristocrats always displayed their fine objects, that was half the point of having them, Queen Mary would pause before something she wanted. She would examine it, lean in slightly, and then with perfect timing, she would express her admiration for it. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? Except consider the power dynamics. When a reigning queen admires an object in your home, you have exactly two choices. You can gift it to her, the gracious option, the one that earns you royal favor and social capital. or you can arrange for her to purchase it at whatever price she deems appropriate, which invariably meant below market value because who haggles with the queen? What you cannot do is refuse. Refusal was technically possible in the sense that no law compelled you to surrender your treasures, but socially, catastrophic. Who would snub the queen? Who would risk royal displeasure, the whispers at court, the subtle exclusions, the sense that you'd somehow embarrassed the crown over a brooch? No one. That's who. Royal biographer Christopher Wilson documented in September 2019 what he called accounts of the Queen admiring a choice object, followed by intense pressure to give or sell these items to the Queen. Wilson noted this behavior generated genuine resentment among aristocratic families who felt they had no real choice when Mary expressed interest in their treasures. These weren't voluntary transactions. They were extractions conducted under the veneer of social niceties. And the stories get better, or worse, depending on your perspective. The novelist and royal insider Lord David Cecil reportedly observed that when Queen Mary's visits were announced, servants were instructed to put away the best pieces before she arrived, hide the good silver, lock up the heirloom snuff boxes, stash the Fabergé eggs somewhere she won't think to look. Families developed protocols for royal visits that basically amounted to concealing anything they didn't want to lose. Once Mary became aware of this tactic, she would sometimes ask to see what had been hidden. Imagine that conversation. "What a lovely home, but I notice the display cabinet seems rather empty. Surely you have other treasures you might show me." What are you going to say? "No, Your Majesty, we hid them because we know you'll take them." These weren't casual visits. They were hunting expeditions, executed with the full weight of monarchy behind them. Mary had transformed social calls into acquisition opportunities, and everyone knew it. Everyone. And yet the system persisted because what choice did anyone have? The Cullinan diamonds in 1905 showed how Mary positioned herself when extraordinary stones became available. The largest gem-quality diamond ever discovered, 3,106 carats in the rough, about 1.4 pounds of crystallized carbon pulled from the earth at the premier mine in South Africa, presented an unprecedented opportunity. When the Transvaal government presented it to King Edward VII, the stone was cut into 9 major pieces by the Asher brothers in Amsterdam. The 2 largest went into the crown jewels proper, Cullinan I, the Great Star of Africa, into the sovereign's scepter, Cullinan II into the imperial state crown. But Mary ensured that Cullinan III and IV, 94.4 carats and 63.6 carats respectively, came to her personally. These stones became known as Granny's chips. Read that again. Granny's chips. World historic diamonds, each one larger than any stone most people will ever see in their lifetimes, referred to like their poker tokens you might find in a drawer. Mary wore them as a brooch, treating these geological miracles like costume jewelry she'd picked up at a department store. The nickname tells you everything about the family's attitude toward gems that would be the centerpiece of any museum collection in the world. Casual, proprietary, almost dismissive. Chips, like something you'd snack on. The Cullinan acquisition established a pattern. When extraordinary gems became available, Mary made certain she was positioned to receive them. She understood that proximity to power created opportunities, and she never let an opportunity pass. By 1910, when her husband George V ascended to the throne, Mary had developed a complete system for building her collection. She had the instincts of an antiques dealer, honed through decades of watching and wanting. She had the resources of an empire, the largest and wealthiest the world had ever known. And she had the social leverage that came from being the most powerful woman in the world's most powerful nation. She was ready, prepared, hungry. She just needed an opportunity commensurate with her ambitions. That opportunity was about to arrive on a scale she could never have imagined. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what was happening in Russia. Not the sanitized version you might have learned in school, but the full horror of it. The complete collapse. The February Revolution of 1917 toppled Tsar Nicholas II after 3 centuries of Romanov rule. 300 years of accumulated power, tradition, and wealth, gone in weeks. The October Revolution of that same year brought Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. Then came the Red Terror, the civil war that would claim millions of lives, and the systematic destruction of the entire Russian aristocratic class. Families that had accumulated wealth and jewels over centuries found themselves hunted, not metaphorically, actually hunted like animals. Their palaces were seized by revolutionary committees, their bank accounts frozen, their titles abolished. It became illegal to even use them. Their land confiscated. Many were arrested. Many were executed. Some were tortured first. Those who escaped often did so with nothing but what they could conceal on their bodies. Russian nobles had possessed collections that rivaled or exceeded many European royal treasuries. The Romanovs themselves owned jewels of staggering value, but so did the great aristocratic families. The Yusupovs with their legendary pearl collections, the Sheremetevs with their imperial gifts accumulated over generations, the Galitzines, the Dolgorukis, and dozens of others whose names meant nothing in the new Russia except as targets for revolutionary justice. When revolution came, these jewels became simultaneously lifelines and death sentences. You could be killed for possessing them. Revolutionary guards searched homes, bodies, luggage. Being caught with diamonds meant you were a class enemy, a parasite, someone who'd exploited the workers. The penalty was often summary execution. But you could also starve without them. If you managed to escape Russia, you arrived in Paris or London or Berlin with nothing. No bank accounts, no property, no income, no connections that mattered anymore. Your jewels were the only portable wealth you had, the only thing that might stand between you and destitution. Women sewed diamonds into the hems of their dresses, the boning of their corsets, the padding of their shoulders. Men hid emeralds in their boot heels, sapphires in hollow walking sticks. Tiaras were disassembled stone by stone, their components concealed in jars of cold cream, in the false bottoms of trunks, in children's toys, in any hiding place that might escape the notice of revolutionary guards. Some succeeded. Many didn't. The Romanovs themselves famously sewed pounds of jewels into their children's corsets, diamonds, rubies, and pearls meant to finance their lives in exile. Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia wore specially constructed undergarments stiffened with gems. The Tsarevich Alexei carried a fortune in stones sewn into his jacket. Those jewels were discovered in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg, where the entire family was murdered in July 1918. The hiding places had done their job too well. When the Bolshevik execution squad opened fire in that cramped basement room, the bullets initially failed to penetrate the jewel-studded clothing. The diamonds acted as armor. The executioners had to finish the job with bayonets, prolonging the horror of the execution while the children screamed. For those who made it out alive, the journey typically led to Paris, London, or Berlin, where they discovered a brutal truth about supply and demand that no amount of aristocratic education had prepared them for. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, known in European courts as Grand Duchess Vladimir after her husband, Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, understood this calculus better than most. Born Princess Marie of Mecklenburg-Schwerin in 1854, she'd married into the Romanov family at 19 and spent the next 5 decades accumulating what was arguably the most spectacular personal jewelry collection of any European princess. She had been close to the center of imperial power for half a century. She had attended coronations, state dinners, balls where the combined jewelry in the room would have purchased small countries. She wasn't sentimental about her treasures. That's the crucial thing to understand about her. She was clever, ambitious, practical. She understood that jewels were not just beautiful objects, but instruments of power, portable wealth, insurance against catastrophe. She knew their value would save her life, if she could get them out of Russia. When revolution came, the Grand Duchess was in the Caucasus, far from her apartments in the Vladimir Palace in St. Petersburg, where her jewelry collection was stored. This geographical accident would prove crucial. She was safe from immediate arrest. The Caucasus was contested territory, not yet fully under Bolshevik control, but her treasures were locked in a palace now crawling with revolutionary guards. She managed to escape to Italy, but her jewels remained behind. The collection included tiaras, necklaces, brooches, earrings, hundreds of pieces accumulated over 50 years, including the tiara that would become the centerpiece of Queen Mary's collection. The Vladimir Tiara itself was a masterpiece of Russian craftsmanship, created in the 1880s by the court jewelers. 15 interlocking diamond circles formed a geometric crown in the distinctive kokoshnik style that echoed traditional Russian peasant headdresses, though rendered in diamonds, worth more than any peasant would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. Each circle suspended a pearl drop. The design was architectural, bold, unmistakably imperial. The kind of piece that announced its wearer as someone who could command armies and topple governments. It remained locked in the Vladimir Palace while its owner plotted from exile to retrieve it. The rescue reads like a thriller. Actually, it reads like the kind of thriller that would be rejected by publishers for being too implausible. The hero of the operation was Albert Henry Stopford, a British diplomat who had been stationed in Russia before the revolution, and who had maintained connections and local knowledge even as the old world collapsed around him. Stopford was not a particularly senior diplomat. He was not a spy in any official capacity, but he knew people. He knew the palace layouts, and he was willing to take risks that more cautious men would have avoided. According to jewelry historians, including Leslie Field in her definitive work, The Queen's Jewels, Stopford used his diplomatic status to gain access to the Vladimir Palace in late 1917 or early 1918. The timing was crucial. The revolution was still consolidating power, the bureaucracy was in chaos, and Revolutionary Guards were not yet conducting thorough searches of diplomatic personnel. International protocols still meant something, if only because the new government wanted recognition from foreign powers. Stopford exploited this gap. He obtained permission, or simply talked his way past guards, to enter the Vladimir Palace on the pretext of retrieving personal effects. The Grand Duchess had somehow communicated to him the location of her hidden jewel case, concealed behind a secret panel or in a locked cabinet, whose location would have been known only to her most trusted servants. He found it. He opened it, and he began the delicate process of removing a fortune in jewels from a palace controlled by people who would have shot him on the spot had they known what he was doing. The operation required multiple trips, according to some accounts, with Stopford extracting the collection in stages to avoid suspicion. A diplomatic bag that seemed slightly heavier than usual would draw attention. A series of diplomatic bags, each carrying a portion of the collection, was safer. The jewels made their way first to the British Embassy, still operating, still technically inviolate under international law, and then out of Russia entirely through the diplomatic pouch system. Stopford's role was never officially acknowledged by the British government, which maintained the fiction of diplomatic neutrality throughout the Russian Civil War. The government couldn't admit that a British diplomat had smuggled out a Romanov fortune, even to save it from confiscation. But jewelry historians who've examined the Vladimir collection's provenance consider his involvement well established, documented in private correspondence and family papers that surfaced decades later. Grand Duchess Vladimir received her rescued treasures, But she found herself in a position that would soon become depressingly familiar to Russian émigrés across Europe. Rich in jewels, poor in everything else. Exile was expensive. Servants needed wages, and a Grand Duchess could not simply dismiss her servants. That would be an admission that the old world was truly gone. Hotels required payment. Medical care for an aging woman cost money. And the lifestyle to which a Grand Duchess was accustomed, the only lifestyle she had ever known, didn't come cheaply. She died in Contoixeville, France, on September 6, 1920, heartbroken by the destruction of her world. She was 66 years old. She had outlived her husband, her position, her country, and everything she had spent her life building. She left behind children who faced the same calculus she had confronted: extraordinary jewels and pressing need for cash. Grand Duke Kirill, Grand Duke Boris, Grand Duke Andrei, Grand Duchess Elena. All of them exiled, all of them needing money, all of them holding treasures that had suddenly become negotiable. And they were not alone. The Russian aristocracy was flooding into Western Europe throughout 1918, 1919, 1920, and 1921. Each family carried whatever they'd managed to salvage, each desperately seeking buyers. The jewelry markets of Paris and London, which had operated for centuries on the assumption of scarcity, suddenly faced a glut. Tiaras that would once have been priceless suddenly had competitors. Dozens of tiaras, all for sale, all from desperate sellers who needed money now. Supply vastly exceeded demand. Prices collapsed. A tiara that might have fetched £50,000 in 1914, when Russian aristocrats were buyers, not sellers, could be had for a fraction of that by 1921. By anyone with ready cash and the moral flexibility to profit from catastrophe. Queen Mary had ready cash, she had moral flexibility, and she'd been watching the collapse of the Russian Empire with an interest that went beyond mere geopolitical concern. The jewelry markets of London and Paris between 1917 and 1921 represented the buying opportunity of a lifetime, and Mary had spent her entire life preparing to recognize exactly such an opportunity. Everything she'd learned, the patience, the eye for quality, the understanding that timing was everything, had prepared her for this moment. The moment when the world's greatest jewelry collections came up for sale at the world's lowest prices. She did not hesitate. The scale of her acquisitions during this period can be measured in the ledgers of Gerard, the crown jeweler that had served British monarchs for over a century. Gerard's records survive because jewelers, unlike aristocrats, kept meticulous books, and those books tell a remarkable story. In 1919 alone, a single year, Gerard's records show that Queen Mary delivered to their workshops 633 brilliants. That's the technical term for fully cut diamonds. 633 of them, plus 271 rose diamonds, an older cutting style that was going out of fashion but still valuable. 904 stones in 1 year. These didn't materialize from thin air. They weren't birthday gifts or diplomatic presents. 904 diamonds don't just appear. They were the dismembered remains of existing pieces, tiaras, necklaces, brooches, parures, that Mary had acquired and then delivered to Gerard for recycling. The process was simple enough, brutal in its efficiency, but simple. Mary would purchase a piece, often at a distressed price from a desperate seller who had no leverage to negotiate. The piece would go to Gerard, where skilled craftsmen would remove the stones from their settings. One by one, diamonds were prized from mounts they'd occupied for generations. The metalwork, the distinctive goldwork or platinum filigree that made each tiara identifiable, that marked it as the creation of a particular Russian workshop for a particular Russian family, would be melted down, the gold reclaimed, the distinctive design destroyed. The stones would be cleaned, sometimes recut to different shapes, further obscuring their origins, and then set into entirely new configurations, new designs that bore no resemblance to what had gone in. What emerged from Gerard's workshops was unrecognizable. The provenance trail went cold. The uncomfortable questions about origins became impossible to answer definitively. You couldn't point to a tiara and say, "That belonged to the Countess of whatever," because the Countess of whatever's tiara no longer existed. Its components had been redistributed across a dozen new pieces, scattered like witnesses to a crime. The Vladimir Tiara acquisition in 1921 represents the centerpiece of this operation, and the timing tells its own story. Grand Duchess Vladimir had died in September 1920. Her children inherited her collection and faced the immediate problem of converting ancestral treasures into survival money. They were not sentimental. They couldn't afford to be. The jewels that had defined their mother's status were now just assets to be liquidated, as quickly and profitably as possible. Within months, the Vladimir Tiara was on the market. Within a year of their mother's death, 12 months, no more, it belonged to Queen Mary. The exact purchase price has never been officially disclosed. The royal family maintains careful discretion about such matters, a discretion that conveniently prevents anyone from calculating exactly how much Mary profited from the transaction. But jewelry historians have examined the market conditions, compared similar sales from the period, and estimated that Mary paid somewhere between £15,000 and £28,000. That sounds like a lot. In 1921 terms, it was a significant sum, perhaps 20 years' wages for a working-class family. But for a tiara that would be worth tens of millions today? For one of the finest pieces of Russian imperial jewelry ever created? It was almost certainly a fraction of the tiara's actual value. The heirs were in no position to bargain. They needed money now, not eventually. Other Russian émigrés were selling similar pieces, driving prices down through sheer competition. Buyers knew they could wait, could negotiate, could play desperate sellers against each other until someone cracked. Queen Mary was patient, well-informed, connected. She had agents watching the market, reporting on opportunities. She got her price, and the transaction was entirely legal. The sellers owned the tiara. They had inherited it properly from their mother. They had the right to dispose of it. Mary paid the agreed price. No fraud was committed, no theft perpetrated, no laws broken. The fact that the sellers were grieving, desperate, exiled, and possessed of zero bargaining power? Legally irrelevant. Contract law doesn't care about emotional states. The fact that the buyer represented an empire that had emerged from the Great War with its treasury and throne intact, while the seller's empire had collapsed in blood and fire? Also legally irrelevant. The law makes no moral distinctions. It only asks whether the transaction was voluntary. Technically, it was. Distressed sales are legal sales. Exploitative prices are binding prices. That's just how markets work. But Mary's acquisitions weren't limited to the Vladimir tiara. Throughout this period, she was purchasing pieces from Russian sources at a rate that transformed her personal collection. Sotheby's held auctions of Russian aristocratic jewels where Mary or her agents were frequent bidders. Christie's, too. Private sales brought more pieces into her possession. Every week, it seemed, another lot came up. The magpie had found her moment. She seized it with both hands. And then, here's the clever part, she made those pieces disappear. The Vladimir tiara that Queen Mary acquired in 1921 was not the Vladimir tiara she wore in subsequent years. Not exactly. The original featured pearl drops, the suspended elements hanging from each of the 15 diamond circles. These were the original pearls selected by Grand Duchess Vladimir herself, part of the tiara's identity and history. A jewelry expert could have looked at those pearls and traced them back to their Russian origins. Queen Mary had new drops made. These featured Cambridge emeralds, stones from her own family inheritance that carried their own distinct English provenance. The tiara was redesigned to be interchangeable, able to display either the original Russian pearls or Mary's English emeralds, depending on the occasion. This modification served purposes beyond aesthetics. A tiara with Cambridge emeralds was no longer simply the Grand Duchess Vladimir's tiara. It was a hybrid creation, something that could be described as Mary's design rather than Mary's purchase. The uncomfortable questions about how she came to own it and what she paid became diffused by the transformation. When someone asked about the tiara, the answer could focus on the interchangeable drops, such a clever design, so practical, so versatile, rather than on a dead Grand Duchess and her desperate heirs. The honeysuckle tiara underwent similar treatment. This piece arrived in Mary's collection featuring sapphires, but she had them removed and replaced with diamonds. The transformation was complete enough that someone trying to trace the history of either the sapphires or the tiara would struggle to connect them. The original honeysuckle tiara with sapphires was one piece of jewelry. The honeysuckle tiara with diamonds was something else entirely. Across dozens of pieces, Mary applied this same methodology. Stones moved between settings, distinctive metalwork melted down and recast, pieces disassembled entirely, their components redistributed among multiple new creations. What had been one tiara became the stones for 3 brooches. What had been a parure became elements scattered across a dozen different items. The 633 brilliants and 271 rose diamonds that passed through Gerard in 1919 emerged as part of new pieces from Her Majesty's collection. Their previous lives as the treasures of dead countesses and exiled grand duchesses erased from the record. Think of it like Lego bricks. You buy someone's completed Millennium Falcon at a garage sale for a fraction of what they paid. You take it apart. You use those bricks to build 3 different ships. Are they still someone else's Lego? Technically, yes. Can anyone prove it? Not really. The instruction manual is gone. The original configuration is destroyed. All that remains are bricks in new arrangements. That's what Mary did with diamonds. Industrial-scale provenance laundering, conducted in plain sight by the crown jeweler. This was almost certainly intentional. Mary wasn't stupid. She understood that owning obviously identifiable pieces from recently deceased or impoverished aristocrats raised questions. People talked. People remembered. Better to own pieces that raised no questions at all. The Grand Duchess's surviving heirs received money they desperately needed. That's the counter-argument, and it's worth acknowledging. Several of her children and grandchildren survived into the late 20th century, their early years in exile financed partly by the sale of their mother's jewels. Without those sales, some might have starved. Grand Duke Kirill, the eldest son, would later style himself Emperor of Russia in exile, a claim taken seriously by few but himself. His descendants exist today, occasionally surfacing in tabloid coverage of minor European royalty, living modest lives compared to their ancestors. Whether they resent the sale of their grandmother's tiara or consider it a necessary survival measure, none has spoken publicly. Perhaps they've made their peace with it. Perhaps they simply don't want to draw attention to how far the family has fallen. Either way, the silence is telling. Queen Mary died on March 24, 1953, just 10 weeks before her granddaughter Elizabeth's coronation. She was 85 years old. She had lived through 2 world wars, the collapse of 4 empires, and the transformation of the world her parents had known. Through it all, she had kept collecting. She left behind a collection that rivaled anything in Europe, assembled through a lifetime of systematic acquisition. The vault she built, and vault is the right word, it required bank-level security, became the foundation of what subsequent generations of royals would wear, loan, modify, and occasionally dispute. Queen Elizabeth II inherited the bulk of her grandmother's collection, and through her, the pieces passed into the modern royal rotation, appearing at state dinners and official portraits in ceremonial occasions, photographed and admired by millions who never think to ask where these treasures came from. The Vladimir Tiara, with its interchangeable pearls and emeralds, has been worn by Queen Elizabeth II on countless occasions over her 70-year reign. It remains one of the most frequently photographed pieces in the royal collection. Every sparkling moment in modern royal coverage is built on this century-old shopping spree during others' misery. The tiaras are beautiful. The provenance is ruthless. And it was all perfectly legal. Here's the puzzle that makes this story stick. We don't call Mary a thief because she wasn't one. She paid for everything. She broke no laws. The sellers agreed to every transaction, even if that agreement was extracted under circumstances that gave them no real choice. But we also can't call her innocent. She saw catastrophe and thought, opportunity. She watched families lose everything and positioned herself to buy what remained at prices those families would never have accepted in normal circumstances. She used her power, her wealth, and her status to acquire treasures at prices that only exist when the seller has no other choice. There's a word for that kind of buyer at estate sales. Vulture. There's a word for that kind of timing. Exploitation. There's a word for buying from people who are desperate and calling it a fair transaction. Predatory. But there's also a word for her legacy. The royal collection. The law doesn't care about any of this. The law asks, was the contract valid? It was. Were the parties competent? They were. Was fraud involved? It wasn't. Case closed. Transaction binding. Tiara legally transferred. The next time you see a royal in a tiara, glittering under state dinner chandeliers, posing for an official portrait, walking down an aisle while the world watches, remember where those stones came from. They came from women who sewed diamonds into their corsets, hoping to survive Revolutionary Guards. From aristocrats who fled with nothing but what they could hide in their clothing. From families who sold their heritage because the alternative was starvation. From the children of a Grand Duchess who died in exile, heartbroken, 12 months before Queen Mary came calling with her checkbook. They came from an empire in flames. And Queen Mary was there, patient and prepared, waiting to make an offer they couldn't refuse. Subscribe for more stories like this.